Hello everyone. We are into yet another week of the clown decade, and it appears that the trans radicals are taking over the asylum. In this case we are going to be looking at the famous case that has been all over the world due to the Olympic Games, and that would be the case of Laurel Hubbard, who is a trans woman from New Zealand competing in the women's weightlifting category at the Olympics this year. And just for a quick overview of Hubbard, it appears that, according to Wikipedia, before she came out as transgender, she only really had weightlifting experience in the junior category. So in 1998, he, at the time I suppose, set the junior records for some categories on screen. I don't really understand weightlifting, so I'm not going to get into it. But then she ceased training in weightlifting in 2001 to then transition in 2012 and then pick up weightlifting again in 2017. So when people say that she weightlifted before she transitioned, this is technically true, but there was at least an 11-year break before she actually transitioned. So she did have a little experience in weightlifting as a man, and then was on hormone therapy for at least 5 years before starting to weightlift again. So it's not as simple as this was a man who was failing at weightlifting, so decided to transition so that they could have an easier time in the women's category. Having said that, when you take a look at Wikipedia's major results for her, she seems to have a lot of first place medals for 2017 and 2019 competitions, with a couple of did not finishes. And then when it comes to World Championships, she either came second or sixth for 2017 and 2019 respectively, and then in 2021, this year's, the other day, she failed to even qualify for the second round. As I think for weightlifting, the judges need to think that your technique is good enough to go to the next round or something like that. I have no idea. But it was mainly that and not the fact she couldn't lift the weights. But I will make this point now, just because she lost does not mean that she did not have a significant advantage compared to the other athletes. It is no secret that when people go through puberty, boys and girls go through it differently and experience different changes. And the important thing is that boys' bone structure and muscle tends to develop a lot more for physical activity than it does for girls. I mean, boys have 60% more upper body strength than girls after they go through puberty. So even after 5 years of hormone therapy, you're never going to be able to get rid of the advantage you got from naturally going through puberty. So no, this is not good reason for, as the trans radical activists will try and say, that this is actually a fair competition and that Laura Hubbard is actually a woman. She isn't. She is a trans woman. We call them trans women because they are specifically not women. And anyone who tries to tell you, well, what about cis women, that's also got a prefix, you can tell them to jog on and that you don't recognise cis as an actual term, since it is pretty much exclusively used by trans radical activists or people trying to appease them. In other words, step over these arguments, they are a waste of time. Anyway, I think we should get into the articles I have. From The Times, Tokyo Olympics, threat of transgender athletes is overstated, say IOC medical director. Hubbard is the first openly transgender woman to compete at the Olympics. Yes, I think there's very good reason for that. The director of the IOC's Medical and Scientific Department has said that the threat of women's sports posed by transgender athletes competing is probably overstated. Well, it depends who's stating it, I suppose. From what you're saying, I'd say they're understated. The comments from Richard Budgett, who won an Olympic rowing gold medal for Great Britain as part of the Coast 4 team in Los Angeles in 1984, come as New Zealand's Laurel Hubbard prepares to become the first openly transgender woman to compete at the Olympics on Monday. This was written before she failed. The 43-year-old, who was born male and competed as a man before transitioning to female in her 30s, will compete in the women's 87 plus kilogram weightlifting in Tokyo. So as I gave more context for that, it wasn't quite as simple as it was continuous weightlifting training before that. There was at least a decade's break. But then the Times gives a bit more context to the IOC's guidelines. So her presence has raised concerns about a potentially unfair advantage being preferred by the physical attributes which remain in the body from her years as a male. Under IOC guidelines, which are introduced in 2015, trans women can compete provided their testosterone levels are below 10 nanomoles per litre. I don't know if that's a lot or not that much for a woman, but I assume it's less than that for your average man. In a statement issued by the New Zealand team, Hubbard said, "The Olympic Games are a global celebration of our hopes, our ideals, and our values." No, it's not. It's just an international competition of sport. I commend the IOC for its commitment to making sport inclusive and accessible. Unless you're an actual born woman, I suppose. But this is the thing. It's religious ceremony again. The Olympics stands for X, Y, or Z high status progressive opinion. Oh, I commend them for being high status, inclusive, accessible, blah-de-blah-de-blah-de-blah. It's only accessible to the people that can actually compete in it. The Olympic Games in no way will be accessible to me. I don't have a talent in that many sports that are at Olympic level, so it's not accessible to me at all. So they don't mean that. All they are trying to say is, you are part of the religious good with this religion of progressivism, or transactivism, or whatever you want to call it. That's what they specifically mean. It's not about being inclusive, it's about allowing them to be included, whether it is fair or not. And in my opinion, at the very least, and in some other doctors' opinions, it is not fair. And this seems to be an issue that is really piercing through to the normies. It was brought up with quite a few of my normie friends the other day, and they all unanimously agreed this is not fair, despite the fact they don't know much about it. It's just when you hear that a trans woman who was a man is competing with women, something in your head just ticks and says, that's not fair if you're a normie. So there's hope yet. The article continues, speaking at a briefing in Tokyo, Budget said, "What's really important to remember is that trans women are women." See what I mean by the trans radicals have taken over the asylum? That is not a normal thing to say. Trans women are not women, as I said before. They do not come under the category of women, they are their own category, because they are different enough to not be an adult human female. And so, in the spirit of inclusion in sport, if at all possible, they should be included in sport. Because of a religious belief, essentially, that is. And it's only where there's evidence of real concern that would lead to a disproportionate performance advantage for those individuals, should any rules and regulations come in to change that eligibility. Well, at this point, why not just ban any woman who has a significant advantage in their testosterone? Since we know it's testosterone that helps with muscle growth, among other things that help with physical activity. Why would it be just the trans women that have to go with that? That's not inclusive, that's not accessible, that's the opposite, in fact. You're singling them out, and honestly, I can unironically see that being an argument made in 4 years' time at the next Olympics. I mean, eventually, if this goes on for 50 years, you're going to have no differentiation between men and women's sport, because there'll be no point. Or another alternative is to have a men and women's category, and then a third everyone can get involved category, which at that point will just be men. But he continues, the IOC is determined to increase inclusion in sport as one of the fundamentals, but at the same time our highest priority is fairness. The current framework or guidelines that have been developed are actually all about that balance between safety, inclusion and fairness. To be honest, I think you can only have 2 out of the 3 of them. I think you can either have safety and inclusion, or you can have inclusion and fairness, or you can have safety and fairness. I don't think you can have all 3. Because at this point, if you want to include absolutely everyone, why can't you include men in women's sport? I mean, to be honest, you basically have. You know, you can have the Try Guys from BuzzFeed join the women's sport, because I'm pretty sure technically their testosterone levels will be low enough to technically be women. But obviously that's not going to happen, and the main reason for the thinking behind it now is that the trans radicals, at the same time, don't see gender as anything other than a social construct which we can ignore, yet at the same time will use socially constructed things such as, let's say, trans women, and be absolutists about it. I.e. saying, if this person says they are a trans woman, then they are a trans woman, even if they haven't gone through any sort of process to transition. So on the one hand, you can completely ignore gender, but when it comes to trans people, gender has to be the absolute pinnacle that we look at. These contradictions can't hold on forever, luckily, but we are going to see many of these trans issues carrying on as a result. Well, let's listen to more of this religious sermon. Asked whether the inclusion of transgender athletes risks reducing opportunities for cisgender women, Budget said, "That is an argument, isn't it? That we spent 100 years promoting women's sport. Is this affecting women's sport? Now, I think that's up to the whole sporting movement, and particularly international federations, to make sure that we do protect women's sport. You've done so much to get it where it is now. So that's just not an answer, that's just him saying women's sport good. And the other important thing to remember is transgender women are women, so you'll include all women if you possibly can. And so that's something that science will help us with. It's gone straight into scientism. Experience will help with this, to make sure that all women have an opportunity. But he's had to repeat the same talking point again. He said it's important to remember trans women are women. He said that word for word twice, almost as if he's convincing himself. And then he makes an appeal to the science, but the problem behind this isn't necessarily the science. You can go super low 60 IQ here and just say men obviously bigger than women, trans women just men that transition to women, therefore unfair. If you get nothing but 100% rational and scientific behind it, then as I say before, why can't you get the try guys in the women's category at the Olympics? Because their testosterone will be low enough for your guidelines. But I think my favourite part of the whole sermon so far has to be this part. Given there's been no openly transgender women at the top level until now, I think the threat to women's sport in general is probably overstated. Wow, the logic though. Trans women weren't allowed in till the last Olympic Games. And that was a year before, so they would not have had time to train. And obviously you're not going to have many women going into it. Not many people are Olympic athletes, let alone trans people. Budget conceded that there is presently a lack of solid scientific evidence comparing transgender women with cisgender women in a sporting context. Please just call them women. Don't call them cisgender, for God's sake. But yeah, it's amazing. It's like, oh, we're really worried about fairness and the science will help us. We don't actually have enough science to make one conclusion one way or another. So for some reason we're just going to do radical changes as if it's fair. There is not enough good evidence base there to make those decisions scientifically, he said. But in every field of medicine and science, the conclusion of most academic papers is that more research is needed. So there's always more research needed. There is some, and obviously it depends whether you're coming from the point of view of inclusion being the first priority or actual fairness to the nth degree being your first priority. So if you don't want to take any risks at all, that anyone might possibly have an advantage, then you could just stop everybody. We do need more evidence because it's easy to compare cisgender males and cisgender women in performance, but it's just not as simple as that. Clearly it would be unfair, but there is a whole effect of that transitioning, which is going to be different in different individuals. But I do notice that he's completely ignoring the realities of puberty here. And as mentioned before, boys after they've gone through puberty, 60% more upper body strength than girls who went through it. And as he says, there does still need to be more evidence done, but as far as I'm aware, majority of that upper body strength remains there with trans women through hormone replacement therapy. But even then it doesn't matter, these are group categories. You have the men's category and the women's category, but then you're going to go to an individual level to see if this person technically counts as a man or a woman, despite the fact it should be obvious. And this is the part of the reason that they are completely trying to change the definition of woman. Woman means adult human female, as man means adult human male. There is no good reason for changing this. In fact, there only seems to be bad and disingenuous reasons for changing this definition. And most people are still going to define man and woman as these things, despite what the trans activists want. Anyway, let's finish this off. We don't know the degree of disadvantage exactly from the whole process of going through transition on your own psychological and mental state. And it's going to be different for different individuals and have a different impact in different events. Obviously. This is why they were banned until recently. The IOC is due to publish a framework designed to help federations decide how to include transgender athletes. It is difficult from sport to sport and sometimes even from discipline to discipline and sometimes even from event to event. Christian Clow, the IOC's Director of Corporate Communications and Public Affairs, said, "The IOC will not be able to put one rule in place which is across all sports. That's the conclusion that we have seen here, but we are working on this framework in order to help the international federations to do that for their sports. And yes, it will require work from home. It's not going to be that the framework comes out and the issue is solved. It's a topic which needs to be addressed, and it really will require work for all of us in order to find the sweet spot for each sport, discipline, and possibly event." Well, I'm not being funny, but I don't really have much faith in you if you allow a trans woman into the weightlifting event, since, as I keep saying, the upper body strength of men is much higher than women. As you say, you do not have the evidence to conclude that that reverses, so why are you letting her in? The answer to that is pure ideology. And you can make an appeal to science all you want, but when you are literally saying the science doesn't have the evidence, you can't really make that appeal. Now, unfortunately, I couldn't find this whole speech with budget, but I did find a Guardian article that went through a bit more of it, and this just shows how stupid the man is. So the Guardian explains that Hubbard is allowed into the weightlifting category as she is below the necessary amount of testosterone. But then it says this: Budget accepted that the 2015 guidelines were no longer backed by science. I absolutely accept that things move on, he said. At the time, the 10 nanomoles per litre was set because we thought it was lower level for men. We know now that they go down to 7 and women can be higher as well. Agreeing on a number is almost impossible and possibly irrelevant. You can debate that endlessly. Yes, I would agree. I do think trans women should not be allowed in any women's sport. And yes, if you do go off the amount of testosterone, the Try Guys could technically count for women. But it also says this: Budget also indicated that he accepted it was fair for World Rugby to ban trans women at elite level because of the safety dangers, while national federations allowed transgender players to compete at club level. Why? So clearly you do accept that trans women are stronger and can do more damage, at least in combat sport, or any sort of contact sport, I suppose, than if it was just women. So why is this fair when it comes to weightlifting, which is still based on strength and physical prowess, as every sport is? He has to concede scientific reality and then at the same time tries to claim trans women are women. It's crazy. It's like listening to the ramblings of a religious fundamentalist. Any substance he has, he completely contradicts with his own ideological speakings. It's ridiculous. This man, who clearly is a religious fundamentalist when it comes to the trans religion, he is the director of the International Olympic Committee's Medical and Scientific Department. This man is head of a scientific department and isn't interested in science. Honestly, this is embarrassing. And I really wish that this was the last bit of trans news I had for you today, but of course it isn't. Trans sex offenders can go on women's wards, hospitals advise. Some NHS trusts say people should be able to choose which shower and lavatory facilities to use in hospitals, because this isn't just going to end in tears. Male-born sex offenders who identify as women can be treated on female-only NHS wards after a risk assessment, some hospital trusts have told staff. Devon, Oxford and Nottinghamshire hospitals have said that a criminal history should be part of an assessment when placing trans patients, but that it should not prevent admissions in all cases. Some NHS trusts have issued guidance stating that people should be admitted to wards based on their gender they identify with and can choose which shower and lavatory facilities to use according to the Daily Telegraph. Absolute clown world. Oxford Health NHS Foundation Trust notes that the risk of sexual offending in a trans context is very rare, adding that where there is significant risk, staff would apply the same robust mitigation that they would on a non-trans patient to ensure a safe, therapeutic environment. Well, it's all well and good for when the staff are there, but what do you do when they're not? And the risk of sexually offending in all contexts are very rare. It still happens, though, and you should try and mitigate it. And I think if you put sex offenders on a ward where they are more likely to sexually offend, then you are not mitigating the risks properly. Dr. Jane Hamlin, president of the Beaumont Society, a trans support group, said, if anyone starts off with an assumption that a trans person is a sex offender, which isn't what anyone's saying, or even a potential sex offender, which again, that's not what anyone's saying, that is discrimination and transphobia. I literally don't care. All patients, including trans people, should feel safe when in hospital. And I think being on the same ward as a sex offender would make any woman feel unsafe, so good one. However, the policies have been put in place despite the Department of Health saying that hospitals should provide single-sex wards. One nurse told The Telegraph that risk assessments of patients, including those with a known history of sexual offences, were not conducted because workloads were too high. NHS wards are replicating what is happening in jails, the nurse has said. And we know for a fact that there has been sexual offenders who claim to be women being put in women's jails, and lo and behold, they sexually offend again. Doesn't take a huge IQ to understand how that happened. Well, this just gets a lot worse. Devon Partnership NHS Trust says that patients will be admitted based on the gender which they identify as at the point of admission, and for legal reasons will not be based on physical characteristics or the person proving they have legally changed their gender or name. Okay, so we're just going to trust people at this point then? Wait, like really? Do you not think people who sexually offend also lie? Risk assessments must be carried out, but it indicates that this does not necessarily prevent male-born sex offenders being placed on female-only wards. Well, that's something. The Oxford Trust states that if the service user has a sex offending history, risk should be managed in the same way it would with any other client, irrespective of gender. Well, that's good. Well done, Oxford. Good to see that university there is being put to good use. It said its guidance follows the legal parameters and sets out that every case is individually assessed, taking into account risk factors to the patient as well as other ward users. So Oxford seemed the most sensible here. But it doesn't end there. Nottinghamshire Healthcare NHS Foundation Trust guidance says that when deciding on the treatment setting, previous history of sexually offending and or domestic violence or abuse should be taken into account. A spokesperson for... Oh my god, I'm turning woke these days. A spokesman for the Nottinghamshire Trust added, all our staff follow guidance to ensure the safety and dignity of our patients in line with government legislation, including carrying out a risk assessment to ensure they are given appropriate care. A spokesman for the Devon Trust said that it was a sensitive issue and that it was reviewing the policy to ensure the safety of our patients and staff. So there you go. The main issue here appears to be that there isn't always time to carry out risk assessments with people admitted to hospitals, and yet they will all just take people's word for it when they say they identify as a woman or a man or whatever gender they identify as. And apparently it is completely up to them which showers and toilets they use. Which in a secluded space like that, I mean, I think you can imagine where I'm going with this. And the Times points out handily at the bottom that they reported last year that hospital guidance issued by NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde urged nurses to chastise women who object to sharing a ward with trans women had to be put under review. I.e., if you think someone is a sexual offender for one reason or another and they have to be trans, well, you have to have your thinking checked. The health board advised staff to treat women who were uncomfortable about sleeping next to patients who appeared as male as they would a racist who was worried about a black patient. Holy crap, imagine going to hospital because you were beaten and raped and you really just don't want to see men for a while, which, to be honest, is very understandable in that situation. Imagine that, and then you're told, oh, sorry, you're as bad as a racist because you're next to a trans woman. I'm sorry, but when these people say, oh, people need to be safe as possible in hospitals, they don't mean that. They're, again, just following the trans ideology, and they're somehow winning. Being a transphobe, whatever the hell that means, is as bad as being a racist, apparently, these days. And you've got to realise that Britain is pathologically anti-racist at this point. So basically, if you don't want to be next to a male as a woman in a women's only ward, you're going to be treated pathologically. You might even have a 2-hour chat with one of the staff to tell you need to check your thinking and to see trans women as women, despite the fact you obviously know that's complete horseshit. Honestly, this stuff annoys me, but that's everything I had to go through with you today, luckily. If there was any more, we'd have to go something beyond clown decade. Maybe the circus decade? I don't know, I'm not very good at coining terms. But to be honest, I'm not going to give Laurel Hubbard that much grief. I mean, I think if she was being fair, she just wouldn't even try and become a women's athlete. Which sounds harsh, but I don't know, mate. I think we need better solutions to these problems than just let her in because she's had hormone treatment. Because from the looks of those championship wins, clearly there's something going on there. And to be honest, I've seen her in interviews, and she does seem genuine and nice, to be honest. And she does genuinely seem to have gender dysphoria, so I think she's just trying to relive a passion she had when she was younger. And I know that's not fair on other women, and as I say, I think it should be up to the Olympic Committee and all other world championships and weightlifting competitions to say no, because you do have an unfair advantage. Now, whether that necessarily means you win in the end, doesn't matter. You still have that unfair advantage, which is the whole reason we split the sports up in the first place between men and women. And when it comes to the NHS, well, you know my position is just to fund the NHS, so hopefully this problem will be solved with that. In the meantime, it's still going to be part of the clown decade, and part of the reason I absolutely hate large centralised government. But as I say, that was everything I had for you today. So once again, thank you very much for watching, and until next time, goodbye.